Okay, we turn our attention now from historical theology to systematic theology. And we begin by way of definition. And this definition comes from the great B.B. Warfield. By the way, Warfield is a particular hero of mine. It is said that he had the theological mind of a Charles Hodge and a William G.T. Shedd, the two greatest American theologians of the 19th century. That Warfield had the theological mind of the two of them rolled into one. Warfield gave this definition for systematic theology. He said that systematic theology is the branch of theological study which follows a humanly devised scheme or order of doctrinal development / presentation, and which attempts to incorporate into its system all the truth about God and His universe from any and every source. We have seen much in earlier lectures about the nature of systematic theology, looking at it through the job description of the theologian. Rather than repeat that information here, what we want to do is kind of fill in some of the cracks with a few more details and observations. As I noted in previous lectures, there are different conceptions of the theological task. Commonly, the task has been envisioned in one of three ways: as sapientia, as scientia, as orthopraxis. You remember that is sapientia is wisdom, scientia is science, and orthopraxis, right practice. One's vision of the theological task will shape the gestalt of the theology produced. A theology that has scientia as its basic vision will attempt to produce a comprehensive understanding of reality. This comprehensive understanding, while perhaps not being a cathedral of the mind in the sense of the scholastic systems of the medieval theologians, will nevertheless produce a paradigm of reality that will consciously attempt to integrate knowledge from Scripture, history, and the created order, the hard and the soft sciences, tradition, and experience to give a comprehensive vision of a theocentric reality. One contemporary theologian who falls into this category would be Wolfhart Pannenberg, who operates under the rubric of revelation as history. On the other hand, if theology is conceived in the sapientia mode, whether consciously or unconsciously, the focus will be the living presence of God. A contemporary example of this mode of theological conception would be narrative theology, which seeks to bring the reader into the biblical paradigm of reality through the biblical story, as opposed to entering through the route of more traditional theological systems. In this diagram of the theological pyramid that we looked at earlier and we have in front of us now, systematic theology is placed at the top of the pyramid with the other disciplines as foundational and their conclusions flowing into systematics. While accurate, the pyramid does not give us the whole picture. Systematics is a comprehensive discipline that seeks to incorporate in some degree all knowledge of God and His universe into its purview. While its focus and material are drawn primarily from special revelation, which, as you may remember, we defined as Scripture, it must also have, at the very least, a passing acquaintance with other disciplines. All of this must be coupled together with faith and the mysticism of the Spirit. Now, systematic theology is, as you saw on the slide that was just up, a joint venture with philosophy. This has been recognized ever since the 2nd century. Even Charles Hodge, the great Princeton theologian of the 19th century, whose formal definition of theology was that it was simply the arrangement and display of the facts of Scripture, recognized in his systematic theology that every theology was in some measure a philosophical undertaking. Origen and Augustine in the ancient church self-consciously employed versions of Platonic philosophy. Aquinas and the schoolmen, as well as Protestant scholastics, employed Aristotle. Liberalism in the 19th century used Hegelian idealism and Kantian phenomenalism, while Princeton used common sense realism. Neo-Orthodoxy has used, in greater or lesser degree, existentialism, as has Paul Tillich. Pannenberg employs Neo-Hegelianism. While the literature provides the primary data of theology, philosophy brings categories and forms of thought to be employed by the theologian in his labors. It is not possible for a theology to be philosophically neutral, since the theologian knowingly or unknowingly views the world through a particular philosophical grid, usually the grid of the culture in which he or she was raised. Now, let's say a few words about the organizing point of a systematic theology. Probably, when most students are first exposed to theology, they have no concept that theology or doctrine is an organic whole. As a youth, I was introduced to various doctrines and identified these as my theology. In college, I learned of the broader concept of systematic theology and even purchased several weighty tomes. The idea of systematic theology was one of a comprehensive, detailed study. It was not until years later that I grasped the fact that the term systematic had as its primary reference not comprehensiveness, but that the nature of theology is that of an organic whole, where everything is conceived and organized around a central idea or principle, and conclusions in one area of study affect conclusions in other areas of study. As the discipline of systematic theology has matured, theologians have generally used a central theme or motif as an organizing principle and an integrating factor. Examples of this can be seen in Lutheranism and Reformed theology. In Lutheranism, the doctrine of justification by faith is the overarching principle and central doctrine of the entire system. Justification by faith becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. In the Reformed tradition, that organizing principle is divine sovereignty or predestination. In classic Arminianism, the principle is human freedom, and in Wesleyan Arminianism, it is scriptural holiness / sanctification. In each system, there is a central idea that forms the gestalt of the system. Individual theologians, too, operating within a particular framework, can also adopt a particular motif that guides them in their task. In such cases, the theologian's particular motif is subsumed under the larger organizing principle of the tradition within which he is operating. As we discussed in an earlier lecture, a major part of the theologian's job is contextualizing the message. One method proposed to accomplish this task is that of Paul Tillich. Tillich recognizes that each age has its own issues and problems with which it must deal. The theological method at this point is dialectic, moving between the two poles, the pole of theological authority. In the case of the evangelical, this would be the Bible and the historic faith of the church, and the pole of the contemporary culture, or what Tillich calls the situation. The situation is the human condition as expressed in the contemporary generation. In one sense, the human condition is the same from generation to generation. Nevertheless, the presenting problem is found in the zeitgeist as expressed in the art, the music, the literature, the drama, the politics of a particular culture and age. A study of these factors leads the theologian to an understanding of the age and the questions being asked, either explicitly or implicitly, and the underlying assumptions about reality. The probing of the zeitgeist is primarily the task of philosophy. The theologian takes the questions and crafts his answers from the authority of Scripture, but casts them in the form which addresses contemporary concerns. Tillich calls this method correlation. Failure to understand the culture leads to what we have described as the heresy of irrelevance. Not that biblical truth is ever truly irrelevant, but that it is not perceived as touching the perceived needs of the audience. This method must be applied in the statement of theological content as well as in apologetics. This is something that we often wrestle with, and with reference to apologetics in the postmodern world, I once heard a major Christian apologist say that we need to fight postmodernism because postmodernism will destroy our apologetic. My response to that is, wait a minute. Our task as theologians and apologists is not to get society to ask the questions for which we have the ready-made answers, but to address the questions that are being asked. That is, I believe, the key task of the theologian, and that is how we are to address the message to areas of sensitivity within the culture, because ultimately those will be the doorways into which we can bring the truth of the gospel and the larger theological truth that undergirds it. Now let's turn our attention to the development of systematic theology as a discipline. So what I want to do is give us a thumbnail sketch of how systematic theology as a discipline developed from the early church up through the present. Now, understand, this is just a thumbnail sketch. It is by no means a complete exposition. We will start with the ancient church. The discipline of systematic theology has its roots in the early church, and it arose out of the life of the church. As we noted earlier, the primary model of theology arising out of this period was sapientia, wisdom. The theological works arising during this period were occasional and pastoral. The idea of theology being a discipline that was conducted in the academy as an intellectual exercise would have been incomprehensible to the early church. Nevertheless, several of the fathers did leave important theological works. Irenaeus, the great bishop of Lyon, who was martyred in the first decade of the 200s in Lyon in what is today modern France, was a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn was a disciple of the Apostle John. Irenaeus is remembered as the premier apologist against Gnosticism in the late 2nd century and early 3rd century. He wrote 5 books refuting Valentinian Gnosticism. The books are called Against Heresy or Adverse Heresies. They were a massive contribution and stand as the greatest source on Gnosticism that is available to us. But he also composed another work, that is, the Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching. This was a handbook of Christian doctrine for ordinary Christians. This is an abstract of the theology he presented and defended in Adverse Heresies. He is not speculative, nor theoretical, nor philosophical. His perspective is profoundly biblical, although he does step beyond the words of Scripture to explain the concepts of sin and redemption against the backdrop of Gnosticism. Irenaeus does not write out of interest in the problems of theology for their own sake. His work, in the strictest sense, is occasional, motivated out of pastoral concern rather than purely intellectual curiosity. In consequence, what he has to say and the way in which he says it are jointly determined by the concrete situation to which he addressed himself. Irenaeus' work had a profound influence on the development of theology, particularly in the East, the Greek-speaking section of the church. Some within the Orthodox tradition see all theological development after him as merely footnotes to his contributions. But even his profoundly biblical perspective and presentation is shaped by the crisis provided by Gnosticism. And we see within his work some speculative aspects concerning redemption, such as the Adam-Christ and the Eve-Mary parallels that he brings forth. His construct answers the current situation and is presented as an alternative to the Gnostic doctrines. Now we turn our attention to the great Origen. Origen, and that's O-R-I-G-E-N, not O-R-I-G-I-N. Origen was a younger contemporary of Irenaeus. He lived and worked in a very different environment. Origen was a child prodigy of Christian parents. He took over the leadership of the catechetical school of Alexandria in Egypt at the age of 18. Origen marks the intellectual high point of the pre-Nicene church, the church before the Council of Nicaea in 325. Like his mentor, Clement of Alexandria, he was speculative in his thinking, and he tried to synthesize Neoplatonic philosophy with biblical teaching into a grand scheme of Christian thought. He was also an apologist, a philosopher, a textual critic, a commentator, and a theologian. He produced over 800 works during his lifetime. His systematic theology, On First Principles, that is our English translation of the title, it was originally written in Greek. The title in Greek was Periarchon, but it is best known by its Latin title, De Principis, because it has only survived in the Latin. The Greek, his original Greek work has perished, and it has only survived in the Latin translation. Periarchon reveals some of the factors associated with the formal discipline of theology that we find arising in the medieval period. His life was surrounded by controversy. As a youth, he sought to follow his father into martyrdom, but to prevent him from doing this, his mother hid his clothes, and he would not go out in the street naked, so he could be arrested and put to death. As the great father of allegorical interpretation of the Bible, he took Jesus' statements regarding becoming eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom literally. This caused him great problems later on in his career with reference to his worthiness to be ordained. He was eventually ordained in Caesarea, but the bishop in his native Alexandria was outraged and caused him no end of trouble. So ultimately, he moved out of his native Alexandria to Caesarea.